Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, The Business of Cloud, sponsored by ViON Corporation and Hitachi Data Systems Federal on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. Our guests today are Todd Simpson, the Chief Information Officer of the Food and Drug Administration at the Department of Health and Human Services, Marlon Andrews, the Deputy Chief Information Officer at the National Archives and Records Administration, and Rob Davies, the Executive Vice President of Operations for ViON Corporation. So we went through the panel so far. We've talked about strategy for the cloud, the acquisition process for the cloud. And Todd, you keep having the foreshadowing of security as maybe the hardest thing. Again, we could spend the entire panel talking about security of the cloud and getting comfortable. But let me turn to you, Todd, to start it off, at least since you brought this up and said security probably is still the biggest challenge, despite the fact that things like FedRAMP are trying to make things easier. Give me your sense of why security still is the one thing that gives you maybe a little bit of a pause.
Well, security is probably the one thing that could get me fired. So, no, just joking. But
well, it could actually.
It actually could. So security is paramount to me because it pretty much dictates the path. And what I mean by that is we have a hybrid cloud environment for a reason. And sometimes we make the choice to put a resource behind a firewall or in our private cloud because the security can't be overcome. For example, with applications that are dealing with high data. So the FedRAMP classification or authorization only applies to low and moderate. We've talked about this. I'm sure it comes up on every single panel, but it's still a barrier. So when we're dealing with any application that is dealing with high data, of course, it's a very easy argument, and it's a perfect candidate for our private cloud. If it's low or moderate, then there are other criteria that we have to talk about, like if there's interconnectivity with other systems inside our firewall. So there's always going to be a security discussion. I believe that the cloud vendors are good at security, and I believe that when they pass the FedRAMP authorization gauntlet, that they've proven themselves, and that there's a good pathway for CIOs to evaluate them as alternatives for doing business with. And there's an ATO process we talked about, and there's a risk acceptance process along with that. So if you're in one of these situations where you absolutely have to go to the cloud to solve some business problem, you have the ability to accept some risk and then mitigate that risk in piece parts as you negotiate the data that you're putting in the cloud. So you can balance it and manage it along the way. I think you just have to be creative about it.
I get the impression that when you talk security, you're really talking about the difference between public and private or some kind of cloud where, because you're still putting secure data, the high data, in a private cloud that you guys run, but Correct. It's still in a cloud. So is that really the demarcation, if you will? We've used that word several times.
Yeah, so the cloud is a trendy word, but I've been doing IT for 25 years, and I've had on-premise IT my whole life. Now we look at the on-premise as a private cloud because we serve our customers from it, and then it's contrasted with the public cloud, and then you have a hybrid cloud model, and it's just really that simple. So it's on-premise versus what someone else is providing for you, and I think that model's probably been around for a lot longer than the term the cloud has. For the government, when we start turning our business over to other vendors to host, to provide services, to spin these environments up, there's risk involved in that, and that's why we have the GSA and the FedRAMP process to come in and say, if you want to use these other maybe potentially risky sources to do business, they have to go through this process. So we rely heavily on what the GSA has done for us. And
Marlon, do you get the same sense that when we talk about security and cloud, that's still the biggest hindrance, stumbling block for many agencies, or for NARA?
I do, but a lot of it is, even on a simpler terms, it's the level of comfort. If your data center is right down the hallway, it may not be any more secure than a cloud provider, but because you can see it, touch it, feel it, unplug it if you necessarily need to, and you know where the data resides, you feel like it's more secure, and it may not even be the case. And so when you're in the cloud environment, you don't really know specifically where your data is. You always have to ask the question, is it CONUS or OCONUS? And so it's all about that comfort level, because I agree with Todd that most major cloud providers do a really good job doing security and keeping security controls and documentation. But it's all about that level of comfort and convincing people that just because you can't see it, it doesn't mean that it's not secure.
And I think there's a movement that people have gotten more comfortable, I'll use your word, about the cloud when it's off premise, but there is that high piece, that high sensitive data that people still may never get past. Rob, what are you seeing from clients? I mean, more and more, are they more comfortable with that concept? As you said, you can't see it and touch it anymore?
Yes, and I think Todd and Marlon made very good points that I do think the CSPs have very good security. I mean, that's their. I would hope that's how they can't. They have to exist that way, and I think they all take it very seriously, and that's good for all of us. I think also it's about, and I think Marlon, you said it. It's about where your data is, and you can have your applications in the cloud, and you can keep your data close, and that is a different. That's a different hybrid, if you will. Normally, people think skate past the. I've got public, I've got private, I've got a hybrid. Well, the hybrid can be, where's that demarcation between where I keep my data, where I run my applications, but I know my data is always inside my firewalls and in my data center, where even though I can see it and touch it, well, maybe I do have really good security for that data, especially when you get into some very sensitive areas. So I think that's another way to look at security, right, is you can maximize your security by how you distribute your workload in the cloud versus on-premise. And Todd, you talked about being in IT and always having managing an on-premise capability. Well, we talked about it with the Marlon, with the demarcations and the SLAs about if you're bringing in assets, all of a sudden now you convert your on-premise infrastructure to an operational expense, and the vendor's responsible to a certain level, and you get to use those resources. And now you've changed your whole budget model on how you go out and acquire that, but it's still in your data center behind your firewalls and configured to your security requirements. So I think that's another way to look at when you talk about hybrid, is just how I use it all and where my data is versus where my applications process.
Todd?
I was just going to mention that we recently ATO'd our software as a service environment in our public cloud. And there's a portion of that environment that we're still working on, the ATO, which actually fits right into what Rob had described, where we have a cloud-based application talking to an application inside our firewall. And this system to the outside customers that submit data to the FDA, they don't see it, but it's this massive hybrid where everything's talking, and there's even an element in our in one of our other cloud environments. So there's, and that's, I think, where we're going. It's becoming a very complex environment, but if you step back from it, it's just one big environment, and that's how we look at it. And it really comes down to the management. And I just want to mention one other thing. We talk a lot about security, but I think we should also mention governance, because I think governance is a big stumbling block. Without the governance, you can't get your customers in and out of the cloud. You can't manage it. We talk about, and I know it's a future discussion that we're going to have, but how do you prevent server sprawl? How do you prevent
cloud sprawl?
Yeah, and so this all needs to be considered, and the governance is just as important. So I think a plug for project management. If you're going to initiate one of these projects and you're evaluating it in your alternatives analysis, and the cloud is one of those alternatives, make sure that whatever alternative you choose, you apply a consistent governance model to your project management. So you're saying, okay, we're moving this resource to the cloud, or we're putting it on premise, but we're going to follow the same security protocols. We're going to communicate it in the same way. We're going to do idle transition with our help desk, and at least follow those simple business practices. And then you kind of remove the complexity a little bit from the cloud and make it look like any other solution that you might buy.
Right.
Marlon, at NARA, did you guys set up a very similar type of governance that manages both, if we'll use the cloud sprawl concerns, but also security?
Yes, and then what we had to do is come up with tailoring plans, because it's not exactly the same, but the governance is a very important piece, and if you don't do that right from the very beginning, then you lose most of the advantages in the end of having the cloud in the first place. So the governance is very important, getting everybody on board, and I think we were going to talk about retraining your workforce, because they need to be very familiar with the new cloud environments and how the differences take place, and how you do development in the cloud is a lot different than on-premise development. And so you really have to set up a whole new environment to be successful in cloud.
Well, since you brought it up, let's ask how NARA is doing that. You have a workforce that's used to systems administrators hugging their data, hugging their servers. Now you have a different set of skill sets needed. How are you guys addressing those?
So we addressed the problem initially through professional services and people who are highly skilled in those areas. And now we're starting to open up jobs and post for openings that are cloud centric, if that's a word, and using cloud and development in the cloud engineers, and people who understand security in the cloud, because it is an additional new skill set that you have to be able to train for and provide and invest those dollars necessary to make sure that your workforce is up to speed.
Now, are you finding people who are qualified for the cloud-centric jobs? We'll make it a word because I like it. Or is it people who are former systems administrators who said, I worked in cloud once? What do you find?
It's a mix, because to be honest, there's more money to be made outside the government if you're a cloud expert. And so bringing those people in are much harder. So you have to be willing or have that workforce who's willing to learn the new skill set and get trained up. But we are bringing in some good people as well. But that's a very demanding skill set that if I was a up-and-coming kid, that's definitely an area I would look forward to in my career progression or career path.
Todd, you guys are also similar to NARA, recently made a big move to the cloud. Do you have that same workforce challenges?
Absolutely. In fact, we were talking about automation tools before. These automation tools weren't around a year ago. Well, maybe a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, though. But we've got a workforce that's 5, 10, 15 years old that have been engineering servers and learning how to support a very traditional environment. And now we have to kind of retool and retrain so that these same administrators can now shift and become the masters of the automation software, the masters of the management consoles, contract management experts. They have to kind of change their paradigm and become more in tune with service level agreements and the service model instead of the traditional model. So yeah, it is something that I think we're all dealing with. I think that I feel like I can brag a little bit at the FDA. Training is very important to leadership. So I was in a meeting yesterday where we talked about training plans as part of all of our PMAPs. And this is something that we've got to bake into every one of those training plans because it's a shift in the way we're doing business.
And I think that's the key, Rob, the shift in the way they're doing business. That's what seems to be our entire conversation today is about that shift. From a workforce perspective, when you guys are working with clients, what are you seeing, and then how do you help the workforce kind of make the change?
So we've been operating in this cloud environment now before it was cloud, for more than 14 years. And one of the things we've seen is you start that contract, and some of these tend to be longer contracts too, because that benefits both parties. They get the maximum value, if you will, out of the offering, and it's in that time period and in that partnership where people can start to make those transitions where you started out as a system administrator, and in some of your environments, a lot of your system administrators, they know the environment really well, and they interact with your program offices and your applications people because they understand the applications pretty well, and that's the kind of understanding you need to have in the cloud. What are those workload characteristics? So getting back to my earlier statement, though, we've been doing this for a while, and in that time period, we've worked with the customers to help them understand how you can use this cloud model to not only improve your business, but you can improve your workforce. We had a customer we worked with for a number of years, multiple locations around the U.S., and when we started, each location did everything differently. They did their system and storage administration differently. And this was a number of years ago. By the time the contract wrapped up and they moved on to a different model, each one of those locations they had the same governance for storage and system administration because it made it easier for us to deliver that service if they were all doing it the same. It costed them more money if it was different. Yep. So, that helped both of us. And I think that's I think there's a lesson in there that we really do want to partner with our customers and help them get better too.
And I think all during the conversation, we've talked about the areas that are biggest challenges around cloud. when we look going forward, when we look, if Marlon, you and I talk again in 3 or 5 years from now, what's NARA going to look like around the cloud? What's the long-term vision?
The long-term vision is that we're going to have our strategy for the cloud 5 years from now will probably be different than it is today because just of the evolution. And once we get the benefits and we're into the cloud and we get it rolling and becomes a normal part of business, we'll be able to see other areas where we'll be able to take advantage of the cloud and to benefit NARA.
Todd, give me about 30 seconds. Where's FDA heading?
We are in the same direction. It's going to be a very robust environment, and we're going to match the network so that we can actually use the cloud in the way that it's was meant to be used.
All right, Rob, you get the last word. Talk a little bit about the if agencies are all putting their toes in it, but what should they know going forward? What's your best advice?
Well, I think that, again, it's pick somewhere to start. Whether it's your email, whether it's your back office, pick something where you can start to get familiar with the cloud, the resources you're going to need to management, and how you're going to interact with it from a security perspective, where those boundaries need to be. And it just can't emphasize enough. It's something you're going to be there in 5 years. Everybody's going to be there, and the sooner you start, the more I think the better you're going to be, the faster adoption you'll have. But the cloud's not a mystery. It's another technology platform, and the governance structures that Marlon and Todd talked about that the government has put in place over the last 10 or 12 years to manage their existing environments, those same structures, it's just now you extend that to your cloud. And there are the different ways you manipulate it, but don't think you have to start something new. It already exists.
And I think that's the best point you made was it's just another technology. It's just we're calling it something else. We've had managed servers. We've had ASPs. Let's move on and make it work. Unfortunately, though, that's all the time we have for today. I know we could talk longer. You've been listening to the panel discussion, The Business of Cloud, sponsored by ViON Corporation and Hitachi Data Systems Federal, on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. I'd like to thank our guests today, Mark Schwartz, the Chief Information Officer of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services at the Homeland Security Department, Todd Simpson, the Chief Information Officer of the Food and Drug Administration at the Department of Health and Human Services, Marlon Andrews, the Deputy Chief Information Officer of the National Archives and Records Administration, and Rob Davies, the Executive Vice President for Operations for ViON Corporation. Gentlemen, thank you for the great discussion. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsradio.com and search Business of Cloud.
On behalf of ViON Corporation and Hitachi Data Systems Federal, thank you for joining our discussion. We'll have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate will receive an email with download instructions immediately following the webinar. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.